This is such a common, I don't want to say mistake, it's just a phenomenon, I guess. And this is what I did, is trying to do too much, is trying to connect too many dots because you care about your topic. And in your head, all of these dots might be connected in these different direct and indirect ways. Well, you should eliminate the indirect ways, only the direct ways. That's what you care about.
What up, everybody? Welcome to episode 16 of the Grad Coach podcast, where today we are going to be talking about working smarter, not harder, so that you can read your academic papers that much faster. I'm your guy, Dr. E, as per usual, and with me again is Dr. Amy Murdoch, one of our expert coaches here to help us work out how to do what we usually do: simplify, demystify, and take all the anxiety out of academia. Amy, pleasure to have you here as ever. Are you ready to explain some of the keys for this smarter, better, faster, stronger reading?
Absolutely. Good morning. I have my coffee. I'm ready to talk about reading. How you doing, Dr. E?
I'm good. I mean, this is what we wake up for, you know what I mean? Like nothing gears up an academic more than talking about reading for an hour, you know?
I live for this.
So look, we can get down to it. But before we do, let me just say that while we know, you've seen clips, you've seen vlogs, you've seen blogs, you've seen all kinds of tips and advice and tricks all over YouTube and everywhere else on this issue. Ways to read smarter so you don't have to kind of bury yourself in literature and so on and so forth. But there are levels to this game. Everybody at Grad Coach over here is a PhD with years and years of expertise, decades between us. And we know that we can do this because we've been helping you guys do this for years, thousands of you between the lot of us. So what we explain today aren't just tips. These aren't just little bits of advice and what have you. These are the keys. These are the ways you go from wherever you started to leveling up that much faster. That's what we're here for today. So on that note, first thing that we want to get to, one of the more basic things that we need to remember, is the idea of categorizing and prioritizing. And there's a lot to be said here for making sure that you work out which kinds of categories of papers to read first, and then prioritize the sections of those papers themselves so that you read only what you need to before burying yourself in a whole bunch of literature that might not be as important as you think it is initially. I mean, am I right here, Amy? I mean, this can be a time saver, right?
Yes, and I think even before that is first understanding what research is. So what makes a study important? What makes research sound? The first thing I think about is the methods. So when you're first assessing whether or not an article is worth your time, I would first identify the methods of that study. So that is, when we're talking about methods, is quantitative or qualitative? Is it longitudinal? Is it a meta-analysis? Is it a literature review? Or is it just a commentary? And then when you're making assessment at this point and at all points throughout, you need to be reading critically. So to become a critical reader means that you're not just reading for fun or reading thoughtlessly, but that the expectation is at this level of academia and at this level of your education is that you're becoming an expert. So you need to be reading these articles with a critical eye. So when you're assessing the methods, you're also looking at various aspects of the study, their sampling procedures, their limitations, and that's something that's going to take a little bit of learning too. But that is, as you proceed in this process, just something to keep in mind that, okay, I'm collecting all of this literature, but I'm not just collecting it, I'm being also very thoughtful and critical about what I'm reading as well. What do you think about that, Dr. E?
I mean, it makes sense to me. I can't tell you how many times we've already done this. I've done this. I know you've done this hundreds of times. I know everybody else at Grad Coach has done this hundreds and hundreds of times. But the idea that we've just sped up the process of, say, a literature review, for example, or going through research, just going through literature, generally speaking, that process has been sped up so many times just by making sure that the papers that we're selecting in the first place are the ones that are the most pertinent, the most relevant, the most appropriate for what it is that you're actually trying to write your research about. The focus on the key parameters of your research and keeping all of your research, the literature that you read, that is, within those parameters. I mean, I know there's a tendency to want to read as much as possible, right? Like, I get it. Like, it's a natural thing. And it's, in some respects, it's not a bad thing. It's inappropriate in this particular point in time because you're trying to, as you said, become an expert at something, and that requires tools and techniques and methods and what have you. There's a practice to this. It's not just, sitting in a library and reading for hours, as romantic an idea as that might happen to be. That's not how degrees happen. And the fact is that as much as you might want to do that, or as much as you might want to be a good academic and read everything, whatever that means, that's not necessarily how the best way to proceed, because a significant portion of the skill involved in becoming an expert, as you were pointing to, Amy, is being able to distinguish, being able to identify distinctions between papers in terms of their relevance, in terms of their significance, and in terms of what does and doesn't matter for your project. I mean, ultimately, it's just not going to be the case that every word you read or every sentence you read is going to be something that's important for what you're going to be writing about. So if it doesn't matter, you don't need to focus on it. So identify what does, identify those things that do align with your research project, and laser in on those.
Oh, no. I mean, think about it. Even if you read every word, you're not going to remember it. Most of these studies, if they're done well, are quite dense. So what I tell my clients is to read with intention, to have a burning question in your mind when you are reading every single study, and have that question, just keep repeating it in your head so that you don't get distracted and get lost in the paper, because that's a real time suck. So if it's a visual, if it's physically writing a question on top of the article, if you've printed it out, or just having it on the wall behind you, just so that you have it in your mind and you keep reminding yourself, what am I looking for in this study? Because again, it's so easy to go down that rabbit hole and just to get lost in the reading. And the other thing I think about is you're reading with intention, you're reading for citations. That's the whole point. You're looking for support from these articles, from academic scholarship, whatever you're saying, because the whole point of writing research, the way to write research, is that this is not an opinion paper. This is you're putting the story together. You're making these points, but this isn't me saying this. This is what has been well established in the research. So this isn't me saying this, but this is what all of these people have said. That's what strengthens your points. So you're reading with intention. You're reading because you want to collect all these citations to support your points. So what I tell people, though, is rather than to read one article and then to write a little bit and then read another article and write it. That happens a lot. I see that a lot. And when you read and construct your paper that way, what happens is when you go back and read it, your whole paper taken together, it's disjointed. It doesn't flow. So before you do that, read thoroughly and educate yourself to the point of being able to easily paraphrase, so that you're using the citations and not letting the citations use you. Because ultimately you want to be able to write a paper that's not, this guy said this guy said this, but it's synthesized. It conveys that you are fully knowledgeable about your topics.
No, I completely agree with you 1000%. And it's the whole, that point about reading with intention, I agree with you, not just in terms of the kind of the reading process. And as you've pointed to, this idea of how that ends up improving the writing process too, because the work will flow that much better because you've got an understanding of what you're writing about. I agree with you on all of those points, but it speaks to what I've said to people in the past, this idea that, look, if you're going to do this, particularly as the levels of the degrees go up, right? So as you go from, undergrad to masters to PhD, so on and so forth, as you make your way through that process, if that's what you decide to do, but as you make your way through that process, these things have to start to become habits. Not just habits of reading in this particular refined space, just when you're at your desk and so on and so forth. They start to become habits of how you function on a day-to-day basis. I say this to clients all the time, like the habit of asking why, or the habit of asking what this means, or the habit of asking how do you know, or the habit of asking where did you get the evidence for that claim. Like, these things have to be reflexes. In addition to, once you started your research project, as you're suggesting, Amy, the habit of reminding yourself what your primary research questions are, what the primary aim of your research is, whether or not what you're reading actually speaks to those concerns. So as you go through everything you're looking at, does it matter is a primary question. And not just does it matter openly, but does it matter to what it is that I'm trying to do? That habit has to be something that you start to adopt over the course of time, just as a way of being, as opposed to something you try to turn on and off whenever you're going from one paper to the next. It's just something that you're gonna have to live with. And admittedly, it makes you kind of an annoying person. But every now and then you might make a friend or two, end up on a podcast, even me and Amy, you could chat with people. It'll be okay. Some people still kind of like you. I mean, you kind of like me, right? We're okay. We're doing okay, right? Like, we're fine?
Yeah.
Okay, it's been a weird week. Okay, leave me alone. The point is, that leads us nicely on to our second key to figuring out how to read smarter, how to read faster, is the process of scanning, skimming, and focusing on those research questions. In other words, what I mean by this is refining the skill of distinguishing what matters within an article, so within a given paper, so that you only read what's absolutely necessary for the purposes of the construction and composition of your chapter or your project as a whole. I can hear people saying this already, because this doesn't sound like what the things that are, serious academics are supposed to do. No one's scanning and skimming out there. So, I mean, do you want to help break this down a little bit, Amy? Because I feel like I'm guilty of something.
Oh no, you should definitely be skimming and scanning. But that's, when you say habit, I've had clients tell me, well, this is a totally different way of thinking and of reading. But, maybe on the outset, it feels that way. But when you think about it, it's really not. When you were in school, you were taught reading strategies. So it might be, if anything, circling back to that. So to those good old days of in high school. And when I was teaching skimming and scanning as a high school teacher, I would teach it like skimming is like you're flying over a piece of land to survey it as a whole, but quickly. And scanning would be zeroing in on one aspect, one part of land and diving in. So you are going to be tasked with reading hundreds of papers. You need to remind yourself of these strategies, reading strategies you were taught, because time is of the essence. So when you're first starting out, you've identified, okay, the method is good. This is definitely a solid peer-reviewed journal. And you've identified that, yes, in fact, this is an article that I want to cite. Okay, then read or skim the abstract. So the abstract should have all the information that you will need to assess is now at this point, do I skim the rest of the paper? And if it does, if it's checked off the methods box, it's checked off the abstract box, then you can skim the other sections of the paper. So I would say skim the abstract, then skim the methods, skim the findings, and then when you're done with that, extracting those notes, copying and pasting, or taking your own paraphrase notes in whatever super organized table or reference manager that you have. Then you can scan for particular keywords. So that's another way to read when you're scanning for these particular keywords. And the keywords, of course, should come from your research questions, as you said.
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing I've gone over 1,000 times. I'm going to keep going over it. We've talked about this before. We're going to keep talking about it because we can't, I'm going to say it again, underestimate the importance of your golden thread. Like we've said this 1,000 times, but it's because it's important. It really does matter. That thing really does describe the parameters and perimeters of what it is that you're trying to do with your project. And insofar as that's the case, by definition, everything that you're doing in that project has to fall within those boundaries. So it's really, really important that you don't forget the significance of that golden thread and the significance of your research questions in particular. And on a side note, for those that don't already know, and I don't know how many of you don't already know, because I'm assuming you've all clicked every podcast episode up to down. You're up to date, right? We're friends, right? We know each other. Never mind. But the point is, whether or not we already have a previous episode on the podcast starring, yours truly, of course, on how to construct a literature review, making use of those research questions, right? So taking those research questions and functionally employing them as a means of not just identifying the papers that you're going to need, but also how to identify the information within those papers, and then also how to use that to structure the literature review itself and determine how to begin and conclude the composition. There is a way to do all of this. There's a system to all of this. And of course, as I said, if you guys want to check that out, there's a previous podcast for that, or, I don't know what you're doing. Stop wasting time. Click a button on the Grad Coach website and hit us up. Like, I'm right here. Like, what's wrong with you? The point is, the idea is that your project is primarily intended to answer those research questions, or at least to address those research questions, and it's supposed to approach or address the aim of the research. So insofar as that's the case, within an article, if what you're reading doesn't do that, that is to say, if the sentences that you're looking at don't directly address your research question or don't directly address your research aims, then you don't need to care. But it's just not relevant or not pertinent to what you're saying. And this is, of course, not clean cut. There are going to be adjacent issues. But for the purposes of what you're trying to achieve, especially considering that at some point you're going to have to edit this work, you want to focus on just what matters. And even within that perimeter, there's going to be a load of information. It's not like you're going to run out of content. That's never going to happen. I don't know. I feel like I'm being a little bit over practical here. Like I'm borderline cynical about composition here. Am I doing something wrong?
No, because what you're talking about is staying focused on what you're supposed to be writing about. This is such a common, I don't want to say mistake. It's just a phenomenon, I guess, that first-time researchers do. And this is what I did, is trying to do too much, is trying to connect too many dots. I remember when I was doing my dissertation, because you care about your topic. That's why you're writing about it. So you care so much, and in your head, all of these dots might be connected in these different direct and indirect ways. Well, you should eliminate the indirect ways, only the direct ways. That's what you care about. And so that's why we keep talking about the golden thread, but it really is a great metaphor for organizing your thinking and keeping your mind tightly wrapped around the focal points of your study so that you don't stray too far away. Because what happens is, you read these papers and I mean, I know in my dissertation, I went back to the entire history of education. I mean, I was writing about everything related to education in the United States I had in my paper. And one of the best pieces of advice that I got was somebody to go, that's interesting, but not relevant to your paper. So I think this is still, it's interesting, but it has nothing to do with your study. You can really only speak to and write about what your research questions are asking and answering. So that's the thing to really think about. If you're studying, let's say, leadership in a particular context, you're not going to solve all of organization leadership problems in every context, only the context within which your research questions are situated.
Besides the fact that it's hilarious, you trying to write about the entire history of education.
I know.
Yeah, well, that's funny. But I'm not going to leave you hanging out there on your own. It's not like I haven't tried to deliver that lecture on a couple of consultations or coaching sessions with people. I'm like, hey, you ever thought about where education comes from for a second? And maybe that's a podcast for another day because I want to give that lecture. But all right, we'll save that for another time. But I mean, I agree with you. Look, the point is that you kind of said it previously, and it's kind of combining points that we previously made, but they're no less true. The idea is that you're trying to arrive at expertise in a specific area, and you have defined what that area is by means of your golden thread. You've decided that the area of your expertise is within these boundaries. That's the area that you're going to be studying. That's the thing that you're going to know the most about. That's the thing that you're going to profess some kind of knowledge of or provide a contribution to, whatever it is. But that's the specific thing that's going to be of concern for yourself and for the purposes of your degree. So that describes your area of expertise. So in a manner of speaking, anything and everything outside of that, not only is it not relevant, as you were saying, but it's just not warranted. Like, that's to say, you're not warranted. You don't have the authority to be able to speak on those other things. They are, by definition, outside of the perimeters of what you say you want to be an expert in. And that's, fine. If you want to expand those borders and be an expert in even more, I don't know, sign up to a philosophy degree or something. Like, meet me somewhere. We'll have a conversation. But until then, yeah, it's a bad idea. You don't want to do that to yourself. But until then,
don't do that.
What I'm saying is that those research questions, research aims, and golden thread overall do describe the perimeters and boundaries of your expertise. So you're required by your own identification of these things to remain within those boundaries to make sure that what you're saying and what you're providing in terms of data, interpretation, and so on and so forth is valid and meaningful, not to mention substantive and an actual contribution to the field. Now, having said all of that, you're still here. It brings us on to the most important point. I feel like I want a drum roll because this one's my favorite point, okay? Like, this is where I'm going to get into my ranting bag a little bit. And Amy, you're going to have to help me. Yeah, you're going to have to hold me back a little bit.
No.
This is where I get to my favorite point, which is key number 3. Get used to taking the scenic route, because sometimes there just aren't any shortcuts. And that's okay. That's fine. Look, what I'm saying here is, once you've gone through what we've described, so you've identified the right papers, and you've skimmed and you've scanned and you've focused on your RQs, and you've identified the right areas within those right papers. But once you've done all of those things to kind of like reduce the overall workload, what you're left with, this is the time for you to hunker down, do the heavy lifting. No one said this was going to be an easy process, just easier than doing it on your own. So, I mean, am I right here, Amy? Is that somewhere along the line, you kind of just got to get the reps in, right? Like, somewhere along the hard work is just what you got to do.
The reps, yes. And I'm impressed. I thought you were going to say something philosophical. I was waiting for some Heidegger comment.
Oh, it's coming. Don't worry, it's coming.
Okay, I'm a little disappointed. I was hoping. Yes. So I think, and I don't want what we're saying now to sound contradictory, but time is important. So when we talk about time, like, I've had so many of my clients, one of the biggest issues that they deal with is lack of time. So they're struggling because they have full-time jobs, life is happening. And so this research process, it takes a lot of time. There's no way around that. So yes, you want to remember, remind, and educate yourself about these reading strategies, which will help save time in reading intentionally. But I think at the beginning, there's no way around putting the hours in. And, we're not talking about sipping wine, fireplace reading. We are talking about research and reading with intention. But I do think at the beginning that you need to find that balance of putting in enough time when you're reading these articles around the topics on which you're supposed to be an expert, to the point that you can easily talk about it without having to refer back. Oh, what did he say? Let me go back and see what that theory, what the seminal scholar said. But knowing it so well that you can just easily talk about it, because if you can easily think about it, easily talk about it, then you can easily write about it. And when you go back and you have somebody else read your paper, they will read and it will naturally flow one point to the other, and it won't read like somebody who's overly dependent on what other people said and how other people said it. So I hope that doesn't sound like it contradicts itself. And I know you feel very strongly about this topic about finding balance. I know that matters a lot to you, Dr. E. So can you please enlighten us about what you think about finding a balance in terms of the time you spend reading?
All right, listen, you guys, come closer. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like I'm being bullied a little bit. You know what I mean? So like, if anybody wants to kind of, help me out, post some comments, just give me some advice on how to handle this environment. Like, it'll be much appreciated. But yeah, sorry, Amy, you were saying balance. Yeah, of course. I'm kidding. No, okay. Let's put it this way. I'm going to put it politely. I'm skeptical about balance, or when people talk about balance, particularly about, okay, so work-life balance is a whole thing, and then that's going to annoy the living daylights out of me, and we can talk about that later. But balance in this context, again, there's a degree of skepticism around what that means. And the reason I say that is because, look, for the purposes of what you're doing, when I say you, I mean you guys out there, for your degrees, for your studies, whatever it is that you're studying, at whatever level you're studying, the fact of the matter is that in order for you to achieve success at the scale that you would like, and I don't just mean for you to just about make it, for you to be able to kind of like, hold your pride, save some face, but not tell everybody everything about what happened. For you to be able to walk around with your chest out and feel, good about what you did. In order for you to get to that level, to achieve those ends, it's going to require you doing more than you thought you could do. That's just the case. That's just what that is. I mean, and it's not something I'm suggesting or you're suggesting, Amy, or we're suggesting at Grad Coach, is a requirement of everything. It's just in the nature of it. I'm trying to do more than I have done previously, which means it's going to require more of me than I have put out previously, which is to say that the discussion about balance just seems inappropriate. Like, this isn't the time when we want to talk about what energies I can reserve or how I can balance my energies. No, right now, your focus is on what is it going to take for me to get to that point, and putting nothing short of every ounce and effort into that focus, into what that requires. And this is what I mean about putting the hard work in, right? Like, look, there's some of us, and I'm not going to say everybody, of course, but some of us kind of struggle trying to have it both ways, right? So some people just want to spend all day long with that glass of wine in front of a fireplace, just reading all day, just buried in books in the library, living out that...
Sounds good.
Yeah, living out that romantic academic ideal of just having thousands and thousands of books to read and filling your head with knowledge. And it's, it's fun, but it's a little bit weird. But nevertheless, it's fun. And I get that. Some of us want to do that. On the other hand, there's some of us out here who are just trying to kind of like get through this as quickly as possible. Or when things get difficult, they rush the process, want to see if you can use AI or otherwise, wait for that podcast, but AI or otherwise to help you speed up the process and get through this faster or what have you. You can't really kind of do this in either one of these ways. There is a balance to this. And I know, I just said all of this stuff about balance, but what we're talking about is a middle path. Yes, I was going to insert a Buddhist reference in here somewhere. What do you guys act like you don't know me already?
Here we go. The middle way. Let's go.
Middle way, bro. Middle way. There's a middle way to all of this. And what I mean by that is, look, the whole point of working smarter, not harder, is that at some point you get smart. Like, that's the idea. And nothing, and I'm saying this from experience, no thing on earth does that more effectively or more efficiently than just reading. And as you were saying beforehand, reading with intention, reading with your mind clear, reading as though you actually mean to do it. So take the obligation to have to read extensively as precisely that, an opportunity to improve, to understand, to put the work in that will ultimately end up distinguishing you from your peers and everybody else. Look, I've said this, I'm gonna say it one last time, but I've said this 1,000 times in the past, in my particular case, and I think this is especially true in academia. Maybe this is why I found myself here, but in my particular case, it's not as though I felt like my whole life I was like, blessed with 1,000 different skills and gifts and what have you. I wasn't, gifted as a kid. It's not like I could sing songs or do any of that kind of stuff. Like, I was not an athlete. It wasn't any of those things. That's just not me. One thing I knew I could do more than anybody else was work hard. I knew I could outwork anybody. And the advantage of hard work is it doesn't take skill. It doesn't take being gifted. It doesn't take having all of those advantages of nature. It just takes the willingness and the endurance to sit down and do it. And the more you do that, the more you start to distinguish yourself, not just from everybody around you, but even from potentially your professors. The more you start to become greater than even you thought you might be able to be, because you're putting the work in, you're putting the effort in, and you're seeing that progress as you do it. So, for all the tips and the tricks out there, ultimately nothing replaces reading, right? Like, nothing will replace the hard work, right? Am I wrong? Am I right? Where am I, Amy?
No, I love what you said about, no matter what anyone has ever told you in your life, you are capable of more than you realize. And I think this process is going to put that to a test. Every step of this process of the, dissertation reading, organizing, writing process is hard because you're on a learning curve 100% of the time from beginning to end. But I do think that's how we help our clients do, is to help ease that learning curve a little bit so that there's not so many sticking points on that learning curve. You have some stages which will go more smoothly when you have somebody who's already done it and been through it and can guide you, for sure. So I think adopting a work smarter, not harder attitude will help you from becoming too overwhelmed. And the other thing I think about that we need to just kind of mention is that universities will have guidelines for what types of articles you can and should include. So that is definitely something you need to have an awareness about. Read the guidelines, know them. A lot of universities, they can only be peer-reviewed articles. They can only be from peer-reviewed journals, and they can only be, published in the past 5 years. Some will have different percentages of like what's allowed in terms of like 85% has to be published in the past 5 years. And then you can, for seminal landmark studies, include other works that go beyond the 5 years. So I just think that I just wanted to put that in there about just having an awareness. Because a lot of times I'll be surprised. I'll ask my clients, what is your university guidelines on? And they won't know. So most universities will have, some sort of a guidebook manual that you need to know very well. You need to memorize that thing because all that sort of structure will ultimately help.
Completely agreed. I completely agree. I mean, like it's the idea that we've kind of mentioned in the past, but the attitude to treating your degree to some respect, or in some respects, treating your degree practically. There are practical things involved in this. There are practical steps involved in this. We've said in a previous podcast, these are licenses more than it is anything else. The acquisition of that degree is the acquisition of a license to contribute or deliver or publish knowledge. That's really what that is, particularly when we're talking about a PhD. That's what that's for. And insofar as that's the case, there are practical steps to the acquisition of that license, which involves, as you were saying, having the important steps and guidelines for what kinds of papers are acceptable, what kind of format is acceptable, what kind of reading is acceptable, all of those things. And you've got to take those things seriously and incorporate them in what you're doing. Couldn't agree with you more. But having said all of that, I feel like we could go on about this for another 30, 35 minutes. And I've got a couple more rants left in me, so I'm going to hold back. We're going to save this for another podcast and do this another day. Yeah, I know, it's tempting, but not today, not today. To sum up, just to remind everybody what we covered. So the point is that the keys here to working smarter and reading faster are categorizing and prioritizing, skimming, scanning, and making sure you focus on those research questions, and then not being scared of the hard work when you have to do it. So after you've done everything else and you're stuck there with a bunch of papers that you have to go through, sit down, grind out, do the hard work that you need to do in order to get your levels to where you want them to be. If you apply these principles, you get yourself moving in the right direction. But of course, if you're still stuck, you need a little more personalized support. I feel like I know where you can get it. You know what I mean? There might be like a whole website or something you could click. There might be a link in the description below. I don't know. What would I know? I'm just on a podcast. They just turn the cameras on around here, bully me a little bit and tell me to talk. I don't know what's really happening. But the point is, the information that you're going to need will be available in the description below. But Amy, I just wanted to thank you again for joining me here for today's pod and helping hand out all of these keys to working smarter and reading faster.
Thank you, Dr. E. It was absolutely my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the next podcast.
And that wraps up this episode. Remember, if you are looking for the kind of support that you're going to need to process these things intelligently and get your work up to the levels that you want it to be, particularly with respect to your literature review or just finding resources, you can go on to the Grad Coach website, check out our blog to find literature review templates, also find templates for how to categorize and catalog the articles that you identify for the purposes of your literature review. All of those links will be found in the description below. Otherwise, we'll be back here next week for another podcast, and I know you don't want to miss that one, so thank you guys very much for joining us. We will see you then.